I think the first and most important is the recognition by many investors that they need advice. If you go back as little as 10, 15 years, it did not exist. And whether you're talking about robo-advice or more human-oriented advice, that is a big change. I think the second is an increasing recognition that taxes are important, because people, except for their pension funds, which are typically tax exempt, people will tend to pay taxes, and therefore it's important to minimize the amount of money you lose to taxes. And I think finally there is a recognition that with a period of maybe 5, 6 years where we've had pretty lousy returns, broadly defined, except maybe for equities, people are recognizing that they need to be careful about the fees that they pay. So instead of accepting the fee as a given, sometimes even thinking the manager is giving them a favor, is doing them a favor by taking them on. They're being a lot more cautious, and you see that obviously mostly in the alternative asset world. You really have two generic categories of investors. You have investors who are contrarian, and contrarian investors typically look for stuff that's gone down. And you've got investors that are momentum oriented, and they go for stuff that kept going up. So you've seen a liquidity driven market, both in equities and bonds, over the course of the last 5, 6, 7 years. Now, one of the areas where I think people are going to be further reducing their exposure, and I think it's a mistake, is in alternative assets, which have produced absolutely lousy returns, but that's what happens when you have a market that's liquidity driven. And so people are disinvesting from that, thinking, hey, you know, why should I spend all that time and effort to make 4 or 5%? My suspicion is that as they leave, the assets of the hedge fund managers will go down, and they'll become sharper in how they manage. I think we are going to see people flee away from fixed income, because at least in most of the developed world, we have rates of interest, long-term bonds as well as cash, that are ridiculously low. They make no sense. From an economic standpoint, they make no sense. You know, you go to Germany, you are literally losing money after inflation over 10 years. Well, why in the world would you bother? So I think that people will take money away from that. You have to be extremely careful with this one, because this is one of those that can be a very easy trap, because you do have developed markets and developing markets. Okay, maybe. But you also have massive cultural overlays. I mean, if you think, for instance, of the South, and I'll start in Pakistan, go to India, and then we go across to Burma, Thailand, all the way to Singapore. You are dealing with people that are naturally more trader-oriented. And whether they be of Chinese extraction, which you would find in a place like Singapore, or Indian extraction, which you'll find in Singapore, but also all the way up to here, and even Muslims in the middle, these people tend to be trading oriented. Now, to say that that is an emerging market feature, I think is wrong, because it's a cultural feature. I mean, Singapore is not exactly what I would define as an emerging market. The contrast would be that you see in certain places in the developed world, you see people that have very poor histories of investing in risky investments. You go back 30 years ago, German individuals owned bonds, not stocks. Okay, that was true in the US 75 years ago. But so I think that what you have to say is that by and large, in the so-called emerging world, people are less educated about markets. But remember, in the CFA, emerging markets are where our membership is exploding in numbers. So it's not going to be long before that gap is closed. I think the one difference, which I suspect is more broadly true, is that there is not as keen an appreciation of investment risk in a developing world than in the developed world. I don't see a huge difference. I mean, they're probably more ready on the surface, more ready to invest in so-called long-term assets. but that's not surprising. Equities have done well for the last several years, so give them a real nasty bear market, and I'm not sure they're not going to do exactly the same thing my generation did, which is, zig when you should be zagging and vice versa.